We are creatures of desire. What we most desire is meaning. What makes us suffer most is a lack of meaning.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Marital therapist, author, and communications trainer Andrew G. Marshall invites guests from all walks of life to discuss what makes life meaningful.
Hello, I'm Andrew G. Marshall. Welcome to The Meaningful Life. We're available on Apple, Spotify, Podbean, and wherever you find your podcasts. Is something not quite right with your relationship, but you can't put your finger on what it is? Of course, you can make a list of what annoys you and the issues with your partner, but it's something deeper, dare I say, more mysterious. My guest is a marriage and family therapist, a group facilitator, and an author. Dené Logan is the author of Sovereign Love, a guide to healing relationships by reclaiming the masculine and feminine within. Now, the idea is we all have both masculine and feminine energies inside us. It's an idea from Jung and depth psychology. But when these forces get out of balance, we can become at war with ourselves, and our partnerships are marked with disharmony. So, Dené, how did you come to this realization that reclaiming the masculine and feminine within us was the way forward?
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me and for asking, Andrew. I have been a couples therapist for several years now, and there's a way that my background prior to becoming a couples therapist really informed the way that I was doing the work that I was doing, and sort of the curiosity that I had sitting with couples that was a little bit different from my clinical training around how you do couples work. And what that was, as you mentioned, I come from a background in depth psychology, which is really rooted in Jungian psychology. A lot of times it's referred to as the psychology of the soul, the study of our collective unconscious. But more than that, I think it's really a spiritual perspective of what we're doing here in these bodies and how we approach the challenges that we go through in life. Before that, I also was a yoga teacher for many years and have always been a spiritual seeker. And I worked in addiction recovery. And so all of those different elements that I sort of brought into couples work really informed the lens through which I was looking at love and relationships. And there's a way that what I realized was, first, that the patriarchal culture that we've all been living in for centuries, and a lot of times I like to really clarify that when I say patriarchal or even, patriarchy, I'm not talking about men or even masculinity. I'm sort of speaking about structures of dominance and the ways that we've sort of been oriented towards the world around us from what I like to think of and speak about in the book as sort of a wounded masculine template, but really from the space of our wounding versus our soul and our, highest selves. And then also that we've lived in this culture for centuries without really ever doing a reckoning around all of these elements of gender and how we've been socialized around gender and some of our pain points there. And nobody in the realm of couples work and couples therapy was taking that really, from my perspective, into consideration, but certainly naming that as a challenge that I saw coming up with couples so often, and I think if we think it's 2025 now, but, women couldn't even have their own bank accounts until like 1974. And so all of those things are sort of playing a part into what our mothers taught us generationally about what it was to be a woman in relationship and how we were meant to interact with our husbands. And I really realized that certainly there's distorted ways that all of us have had relationships with our ideas around masculinity and femininity and what that means for us, but also that there's ways that we've sort of been playing out what I call ownership templates in partnerships and really sort of competing for energy and figuring out how I can get my needs met versus really attempting to see one another, as souls who are, two people on our own unique soul mission to carry out the things that we came to do in this lifetime. And that what if love and relationships were about each of us really supporting one another in doing that work that we came here to do versus sort of being in that adversarial role that I think we often get into in our relationship dynamics,
So there can't be much more adversarial situations than when you have a marriage breakdown and a divorce. How did that impact the way that you approached marriage counseling?
Yeah. I mean, I think even in that, there's a way that we're conditioned to hold things like a marriage breakdown or a divorce as if there's a failure or a catastrophe. That wasn't my experience. My child's father and I were married for 12 years. He's still one of my best friends on the planet, and we get along really well. And there was so much about the way that we decided that our relationship needed to change form. And I say change form quite intentionally because we'll always be in one another's lives. Not only are we friends, but we have a child together. And we really had sort of the shared perspective that, if we have loved one another for this long, and this was something I was always curious about, like when people decide that their marriage needs to dissolve, like where does the love that was there between the two of you go? Did it just like disappear and all of a sudden we just can't stand one another? Like, how does that happen? But that was not my truth. That was not what I wanted my child to experience as our truth. I really wanted him to know that he came from a place of love and that the love continues. But I think we live in a culture that really measures marital success by longevity. I don't think that that's the case. I think, we'll go to weddings sometimes and they'll have everybody dance, and like the couple that have been married the longest keep dancing and everybody else sit down based on how many years you've been married. But nobody really asks that couple what it's been like and what it's felt like in that marital dynamic. Are you still growing? Are you still challenged to be the fullest iteration of self in this dynamic? We just sort of say, well, it must be a success because they stayed in it. And, I'm sure you understand this as a couples therapist. I often am seeing the behind the scenes, not the highlight reel of people's relationships. And so I don't know if we should be celebrating people, really in spaces where they're not thriving and they're not living in alignment with what is their truth in terms of what they came into this life to do and be, but they've stayed in the marriage, right? And so I really attempt to see relationships through a different lens. I believe relationships are divine assignments, and that whatever sort of comes to the surface and is evoked within me within this relationship dynamic, it's information about what there is for me to heal. And it's sort of a mirror showing me to me. And when a relationship needs to change form, it's less that anybody's failed or there's been a breakdown, but that maybe our souls are meant to go on different paths at this point. And can that be okay?
Now, when we're talking about what we're going to be going into, the main thrust of this interview, which is about masculine energy and feminine energy, it's really important that you don't start thinking about what I would call typical male behavior. So it's not about liking football and drinking beer, and feminine energy is not about makeup and wearing pink. So you take all of those sort of ideas to one side and let's actually look at what is masculine energy. And the idea is you have masculine energy inside yourself and I have feminine energy inside myself, and I can also have masculine energy, and I need to have both of them in good state of health and they need to be balanced. That's the central idea.
Yeah.
So let's get started. Because this is such a big topic, I've sort of broken the subject of what is masculine energy down into a few headings, which I think will help us sort of get away from the stereotypes.
Right.
And obviously women can have all of these things as well. So the first one is structure. So tell us about structure.
Yeah. There's a lot about our society that has sort of like, there's a structure of the way that things should be. And that's a lot of what, I don't think anything when we're talking about these energies or the idea of structure is a bad thing at face value. But I think too much of anything.
We need structure. This interview has a structure to it, but it's not going to dictate everything, but it's holding us. Yeah. We need structure.
Absolutely. I think without any sort of structure, we're sort of untethered. And there's a lot of, just that thing of like destabilization. And I feel like I am not rooted in anything that gives me the opportunity to like exhale and feel like I'm okay. So we do need some sort of structure. Now, if there is too much structure, it sort of becomes a stifling of life force. And if we think about masculine as the structure and feminine energy as the aliveness, if we have too much containment, too much structure around whatever the thing is, the relationship dynamic, we need aliveness too. We need to be expanding. And so whenever we're talking about any of these energetics, it's sort of like, how do I bring it into a more balanced state sort of to that point you're making, that all of these things are things that are within all of us, whether it's from a wounded space or a healthy space. But how do I sort of come into right relationship where things have gotten a little bit distorted? And I think our society has almost put too much emphasis on structure, and that there's a quote, right way to do life and a right way to do relationships and a blueprint for if you just follow this path, then you'll have a happy life. And I think attempting to fit ourselves into structures that are not always aligned with the truth of who we are is why we sort of have some of these struggles that are, the mental health struggles or the ruptures in our relationships that come to the surface when we're trying to make ourselves fit in boxes that we don't fit in.
So the next of the masculine energy items that I've pulled out is being externally focused.
Yes, absolutely. And to me, that's that thing of us being in a society where we focus a lot on how things look from the outside, but not how they feel on the inside. So everybody's sort of comparing their inside, how their life is actually feeling for them with everybody else's highlight reels on Instagram or social media. Now, we don't actually know what those people's lives are really like, but we're sort of conditioned to believe that what matters is how things look, keeping up with the Joneses, like, don't air your dirty laundry, all of these phrases that so many of us grew up with as like the normalized ways that we are sort of prioritizing how things look from the outside, how people perceive us from the outside versus how we actually feel living our lives from the inside out. And again, I think that's where we are relational creatures. We need to be in relationship to other people. And it's not like, I don't care anything about how other people perceive me, because that would be sort of the pendulum swinging in the opposite direction a little too far. But I think we need to put more emphasis on how we feel about our lives for ourselves.
And the next one, which is a way of looking through the world, is a rational, scientific sort of approach.
Yes. I think, Andrew, there's a point that we societally really put all of our faith in science and in the things that are like the tangible, what we can see, hear, taste, touch, smell.
So, for example, we can't see the soul you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. And in that, I think we've lost our connection to our soul. We've lost our connection to the ethereal and the luminescent aspects of life and the things that you can't measure, but you just feel, the intuition, the spirit, the love, all of these aspects of the life force energy that exists within all of us, which is really the connection to our feminine. We have really been conditioned for centuries to not put a lot of value on those things. And in that, we've lost our connection to it.
But with all of these things, we do need them as well. So
absolutely.
That's the difficult part. So we're not repudiating any of these things.
Yeah.
This is another masculine energy. They are focused on the task. We've got a job to do, and we're going to have a narrow focus, and we're going to get it done, which is sort of rather brilliant because, we will get to Timbuktu.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying is important because as we talk about integrating these masculine and feminine energetics, not only are we in no way sort of repudiating or feeling like masculine energy is a bad thing. I would say on the contrary, we're actually a society that doesn't have a ton of examples of actually being in healthy masculine energy and what that looks like. But if we sort of go back to this thing of action, what you're talking about, I think action from the space of fear and attempting to like muscle my way into things and fit a square peg into a round hole is very different than inspired action. And, getting into the space of stillness and identifying my truth for myself and then moving from that space of divine guidance and wisdom. And then we get to be in the world creating something, not from the space of fear, but from our essence and who we have the potential to be.
And I'm going to put the next two together because they sort of fit together. Following the rules and what I'm going to call the first half of life. Why is the first half of life all about following the rules?
Yeah. So, you mentioned Carl Jung's work when we first started, and Jung talks a lot about the process of individuation and that the first half of our life, we are oriented toward the world around us. And that is sort of us in the masculine, the action, the making things happen. And the second half of our life, we're oriented towards the inner world, the feminine, the sort of contemplative space. And I think when we first come into this life, we need something to be tethered to, as we're talking about. Like, you need that structure. You need an attachment figure. You need something to feel like this is how you do life and this is the blueprint you're following.
you don't know what to do, so you might as well copy the big people and see what they're doing. I mean,
exactly.
You've got to start somewhere. You might as well,
right.
Society says if you get a good job, you get the corner office, you're going to have a good life. Well, it's worth a try, isn't it?
Well, and, I think, yes, absolutely. We need something. And if what doesn't feel resonant to me is having the corner office, if for whatever reason I'm in school and it's really hard for me to be still and follow the structured path of 8 hours sitting in this desk, a lot of what we do is we pathologize that and we make that something wrong with you versus just understanding that, this is one path, the corner office, the following the path of whatever least resistance, or maybe there's nothing wrong with you, but your path is meant to be different. Maybe you're meant to be a painter who travels the world and, sees beautiful things and shares that beauty and creates meaning for people when they see your art. Maybe that's your path. But I think what we've lost track of is, yes, there is a structure that we need. We need, attachment. We need connection to other people. But I think the idea that there is one way that is an acceptable way to live life, and that if you step outside of that structure, that there's something, quote, wrong with you, is what I believe collectively is starting to shift as we move into a little bit more of an integrated of our feminine perspective way of seeing the world.
So being very masculine and staying with the structure, I'm just going to do a quick recap. So the masculine energy, structure, externally focused, rational, focusing on the task, following rules, and it's something that is much more sort of around the first half of your life. So now we're going to do the feminine energy, which hopefully I'm going to exhibit as well, because I think I'm definitely interested in seeking, which is the first thing that you talk about. So tell me about seeking.
Yeah, in that individuation process that we were just talking about, I think normally there's a point in our life where some of the structures as they've been, we start to feel like we need to challenge them. The things that we have been conditioned to believe will keep us safe, for whatever reason, that truth becomes challenged, whether it's, a heartbreak or a death of someone who was really important to us, or, collectively, what so many of us have experienced over the last 5 years, the 5-year plans that all of a sudden were taken away in terms of the things that we thought were certain. And when we're in that place of all of a sudden, everything that I've known to be up to this point has been taken away in terms of depth psychology, it's sort of discussed as like we enter a dark night of the soul. And in Western civilization, we don't have a lot of context for this is like a very normal thing of our human experience, that we will go through these dark night periods. And they're really processes of initiation where we are leaving one way of being in the world and coming into a new iteration of self. And that is going into that dark energy where we start seeking and we start looking for answers and guidance from, something bigger than ourselves. That is often when we have entered the dark, hallowed spaces of our feminine. And the seeking is really seeking answers and seeking a new way of experiencing the world around me.
And I think people can see that in comparison with the masculine, we're coming to the next heading, which is internal.
Yeah. So, even if you think about our anatomy, the masculine is externally in terms of like how we procreate. The feminine is the energy that is internal, right? So there's a lot about the feminine that is the space of the unknown manifestation, where we birth life from. That is like through the feminine vessel. And so there's so much about the feminine energetics within all of us that is the inner space, the space of contemplation and where I go within to attempt to know my inner landscape a little bit more intimately.
And the next feminine energy is emotional.
Yeah. And this is one of those places where it's interesting, right? Because I think certainly we think of emotion, even as you say emotional, as something you're so emotional. It's something we're certainly conditioned to hold a lot of charge around, maybe judge ourselves for. I know when I'm like really emotional or crying for, quote, no reason, I judge myself, right? Because I've been very conditioned to do that in our structural paradigm. But, the emotion within all of us is a part of our feminine. That's the the part of us that is in tune with all of the complexity of who we are as human animals. And I can't tell you, I'm sure you experience this as well, but how often someone will start therapy and it'll be like, how are you? I'm fine. Okay, well, what does fine mean, right? It's so much of what we've been conditioned to do to not have a real wide range of ways that we are in relationship to what I'm feeling and what my emotions are. And so we sort of just are at a baseline of like happy, sad, and that's it, when really there's a lot of complexity.
My parents brought me up thinking that emotions would get in the way of things. It stopped you getting things done. They were rather inconvenient things that you'd be better off without. Now, I'm exaggerating, and they never actually said those words, but that was the sort of the unspoken message.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I joke with my mom still that when I was younger, she would say things like crying doesn't solve anything, right? And that the goal is to be productive or like to continue to do things that make sense and take you from point A to point B versus just feeling my feelings because I'm alive. And that's a part of what I came here to do,
So the next feminine energy is about seeing the big picture being connected to something larger.
Yeah. I believe that we are living through a time in history where we are returning to the space of prioritizing making meaning. I just saw this thing before I logged on with you where someone who worked in hospice was talking about like the 5 regrets of the dying. And I think so much of what we are conditioned to prioritize when we leave these bodies really is not that important. How many followers or likes we have on social media, how much money is in our bank account. We don't take it with us. The extent to which we have power or a certain level of prestige, all of those things become irrelevant at the end of our lives. But what does matter to us is the quality of our connections and the meaning that we made, and maybe even the legacy that we leave behind us. But again, I think those are things that in the second part of life, we start to really contemplate a little bit more consciously and saying to ourselves, if I'm going to be, and this is like developmentally appropriate because, when we're young, even like the part of our brain that understands that we won't live forever isn't fully developed, which is why we sometimes do, dangerous things. And we're not always so careful with ourselves when we're younger. But then as we get older, we become a little bit more aware of the fact that I'm not going to live forever and that this life is fleeting and really sort of sacred to have this time here with my family and with the people I love or whatever that means for me. But it really becomes, I come into that space of making meaning, and that is getting in touch to me with the feminine energetics within.
Well, you've already come on to the 5th and 6th point, questioning rules and the second half of life.
Yeah, I think, as we were saying before, in the beginning, we really need attachment. We need something to be tethered to. But we also have this other fundamental human need, which is a sense of aliveness and expansion and a sense that we are authentic and that we get to show up as the truest version of who we are and that we are worthy as that version of self, right? But attachment always trumps authenticity in the beginning because it's a survival need. And so when we're babies, we really need our caretakers for survival. And so we get this conditioned way of being that's like, I have to sort of follow the cultural paradigm as it's been to get acceptance, to fit in. And as we get older, what I find is happening more and more, and certainly is always the case in the later half of life, but I think there's sort of a quickening of this process happening. And I'm seeing younger people coming into this exploration even earlier. And it's becoming, if all of these attachments aren't the thing that allow me to be the fullest embodiment of myself, then is that real true belonging? And if it's not, what does it look like to show up as a more authentic version of self and trust that the people that are meant to find me along my path will find me and we will create community in those ways? But it really requires sort of taking a leap of faith and to being that authentic version of self.
So let's just do a quick recap of the feminine energy: seeking, internal, emotional, seeing the big picture, questioning rules, and being something that comes to the fore more in the second half of life. So what are the presenting problems, the issues that couple brings into your office that suggest to you that the masculine and feminine need rebalancing? So people can sort of think, yes, I recognize myself, because it's a bit abstract at the moment.
Yeah. I was leading a group talking about relationships last night, and I was asking the group to tell me what they think are the most common things that couples come into couples therapy as like a presenting issue or the thing that they're struggling with. And almost everybody started to say money, finances, money. And I was like, that's fascinating. People almost never come to see me about money and finances. That's not like the presenting issue.
It isn't for me either.
Right. I was like, it's normally something around either their sex lives, and that can be like a rupture based on infidelity or misaligned desire and things that are around our physical intimacy. Or what is the most common, I think, these days is equal distribution of emotional labor and responsibilities and feeling like things aren't fair and tit for tat and sort of, competing for the energetic resources, right? And how we get all of the things done. And so, if we start with the conversation around our intimacy, and I think there's a way that we are all conditioned to believe, as we were talking about before, that the most important thing is that we keep the structure intact, right? And to me, that is sort of like a hyper emphasis on the masculine. Keep the structure in place. As long as we stay in the marriage, communicate as effectively as we can, like this is like what we're doing to stay in the bunker and things are good there, then that's all we should need. But what we understand, and has actually always been the case if we're honest about it, is we also need life force. We also need aliveness and eros and excitement. And if we attempt to only put an emphasis on the structure, the feminine, the aliveness, will rear its lovely head in some way, shape, or form. And what I find that ends up looking like is maladaptive maybe, but it's an affair or something where like I'm just like really unsatisfied with our intimacy and things like that. And so it is the feminine attempting to come to the forefront, right? And then there's a way, so that would be like the physical intimacy that's showing up. And to me, that was like a part of how I saw the masculine and feminine energetics sort of being out of balance. But the other part is this whole thing around what a patriarchal context has sort of created in terms of distortions. And I'm going to speak heteronormatively in this case, but this shows up in my same-sex couples just as much. But there's a way that if I am putting in this structure that the woman in the relationship should always be in the space of giving and taking care of everyone else and doing all of the emotional labor and sort of always in the output, she is actually in a very masculine energetic in most of her life, right? And so what this ends up creating is a distortion around, she sort of ends up being sort of in mommy energy. And there was a lot that I couldn't see until I had a child around, first of all, how I had just been socialized to really live in a wounded masculine energy most of the time. But certainly once I had a child, what is sort of the counterintuitive thing about motherhood and the way that we structure it in Western culture is women are really in their masculine when they have a baby. It's very task and contain and keep safe and structure and diagrams and all of the ways that we're like keeping this kid alive. And what I saw with so many couples is it would become like a battle of the alphas, right? It's like the woman is sort of like out alphaing her husband and everything you're doing is wrong and get out of my way and don't do this and you're not helping me, and a lot of like really wounded masculine energy. And meanwhile, the husband in the relationship dynamic is so often feeling a lot of abandonment. My wife, as I've known her up to this point, is not the person that I married. She's,
she's become mumzilla.
Yes, she's speaking to me as if I'm an idiot. Like all of these things are just like creating all of these distortions. And what I realized was there's a lot about this that is just like misalignment of masculine and feminine energetics. And it's sort of us bringing into balance what has been distorted about us attempting to do things from, what I would say the nuclear family structure creates imbalance, and it's too much for two people to do by themselves. Period. I think in more collectivist cultures, there's a way that like an entire village is there to support a woman after she has a baby. So all of the women come in and give you time to heal. And you will nurse your child, but you have time to like come back into this new sense of self, because it can be really destabilizing after you have a baby to be like who am I now? I'm not the maiden anymore. I'm the mother. But what does that mean? And what does that look like? But for the couples I see, it's just two people trying to do all of this without any framework. And we do need that masculine framework to sort of give you an idea of like how to hold this and what that looks like. But I believe we're moving into a space again where we're really understanding we need a village a lot more than we have been conditioned to think that we do. And what I thought was so beautiful in 2020 was I was watching as the world sort of stopped and everyone still had to keep working, but they had these kids at home. And all of a sudden, what they started to do was evoke the energy of the village. And it was like, these neighbors that I've never met also have a kid at home. What if we talked to them and we took turns watching each other's kids while each of us worked, and we figure out how we can collaborate? But that's a very feminine way of meeting how we solve a problem, right? It's the space of collaboration. And I think we're coming back into an awareness that like we need one another, absolutely, but we need to do it from collaboration. Yeah.
So when we're saying we need more feminine energy, it's not just that the men who need more feminine energy, it's the women who can often need more feminine energy too.
Quite often more, I would say. Yes.
Right. And so how do we get more feminine energy into our world? Well, not into our world, because I'm not interested in the world. I'm interested in my listeners' lives. So how do we get more feminine energy into our lives?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, it becomes incumbent upon all of us to value the feminine within us, within our partners. And I'm saying that to women just as much as I am saying that to men, because I think a lot of times what I find with my male clients is their first experience a lot of times of being shamed for their feminine was a mother, or, ways that maybe on the schoolyard they were shamed for not being willing to fight or wearing pink or whatever the thing was. But a lot of times it was their first heartbreak and a way that they were vulnerable. And a woman really shamed them for their feminine and their vulnerability. And so they were conditioned to shut that down, right? But I think when it comes into our relationship dynamics, and I have this chart in the book where I sort of have a quadrant where you can identify like where you are in terms of your energy. And it's really taking a lot of responsibility for your own energy. So if I'm a woman and I'm in my wounded masculine energy with my partner, and that means I'm sort of in that space of contempt and judging him and pulling away and needing to fix everything and, telling him everything he's doing wrong, then it really is my responsibility to try to transition into my healthy feminine with him. And what that looks like is trusting that if I speak from the space of vulnerability and telling him what I'm overwhelmed by and maybe making a request instead of sort of being in the space of resentment, can I be in the space of asking for his buy-in and his consent on supporting me and maybe helping me come up with a plan for how we can reorganize and divide and conquer our lives a little bit. But that really requires that I don't think that it is, quote, weak for me to be vulnerable with my partner,
So let's look at masculine energy. So obviously men need healthy masculine energy and women need healthy masculine energy. Yeah. How do we get more of that rather than just shouting at each other?
Yes. So when I think of that healthy masculine, and I often say like containment, it's the energy of cultivating a toolkit that reminds me of the truth of who I am, that gives me that sense of inner confidence and belief in, the person that I am and the person that I came to be, so that I know that a lot of times when I think of masculine energy, I think of mission and I think of like the larger why behind whatever I'm doing. And so I think when I feel like I'm in that sort of anxious, wounded feminine energy, regardless of my gender, my work is to come back home to myself and to really get clear on, if nobody else believes in me and nobody else ever is able to see me in the way that I long to be seen, I believe in me and I've got my own back. And I sort of do these things to come home to myself versus that thing of feeling like I need to externalize my power and how the world views me as the truth of who I am. It's like, no, I know who I am, because that is so much of like what I believe we're starting to do is like remember the larger truths of who we are versus sort of the physical realm, lower truths of who we are.
So let's look at this whole idea of getting the different masculine and feminine energies in balance through the lens of a particular problem that I've been sent in. And we'll do that in just a moment.
The The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Please follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material and other benefits.
You can participate in the program, send me a letter by going to my website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcasts, and there you'll find participate in the show. There'll be a box that'll open and you can write to me, which is what this woman has done to me. I'm struggling with getting my husband to understand the weight on my shoulders. I'm working 4 days a week, running the house and doing the majority of the care and organisation of our 2 teenage daughters. My husband expects a round of applause for taking a load out of the washing machine, hanging it up, folding and putting it away. I am the person who knows our daughters' friends' names, their teachers, where they need to go and who will pick them up. My husband thinks that turning up where I tell him and when is his contribution. I don't want to get into a I work harder than you contest, something my husband likes to do, but I'm so tired and sometimes cranky. How can we share out the burden more equitably? Whenever I try and pass some of the responsibility onto my husband, balls get dropped and a child is stranded somewhere. I end up getting frustrated, plus still having to do it myself.
Yes. Well, just so much love to this person that wrote in because, sister, been there, I understand. And there's a lot of ways that even in the language that you're using, we were talking about this thing of how we as women, especially when we become mamas, there's this thing and it's a lot of our conditioning. So it's nobody's fault. It's just like what we've been conditioned to do, to start to see our partners, the men in this case, as a little bit inept, a little bit I can't trust you, a little bit, that I have to sort of like stand behind you and micromanage how you're doing things. And I'm carrying the emotional labor and I'm doing all the things. And it's not that those things aren't true, that, I may be carrying a little bit more of the emotional labor and awareness of the play dates and my kiddos' friends' names, all of the things. But there's a way that this sort of martyr energy that a lot of us have had passed down from our mothers, it becomes this thing of like, do I want to be the one who is doing it right? Or do I want to sort of have some ease and a little bit of relief from the situation? And I say that thing around, do I want to be right? Or do I want to have a little bit of relief? Because a lot of times, and I'll be the first one to raise my hand on this without even a smidgen of righteousness, I wanted to be right more than I wanted to actually have ease. And that thing,
the opposite way round, I'd much rather have peace than be right.
Well, I find that is quite often the case with men in these dynamics. And here's what ends up happening, Andrew, and I'm sure you have experienced this a lot with the couples you work with, that like a man in this dynamic attempts to do it the way that he would do it only so many times. And then, there's this thing of like, I have noticed fundamentally, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that often they say that actually when the wife's away for the weekend and they're looking after the children themselves, they do it their way. It all runs very smoothly. Thank you.
And that's the thing. It's a little bit like, that's a really important point. And so I'm going to speak to that first in this thing of like, my child has the most incredible father. And a lot of what made him be such an incredible father is that like part of the time he's just with his dad. And it really gave him the opportunity to step up as a father and, do things his way. And a lot of times what I have found is we as women are really not allowing our partners to step into that space. And we're doing it because we don't trust that it will get done. But the really deep inquiry we have to sort of have a reckoning with within ourselves is, if I don't trust this man, why am I with him, right? Like, this is my man. This is my partner. It is important that I believe in who he is. Now, a lot of that, again, sort of circles back to those multi-generational pain points. And a lot of the messaging that we got as women from our mothers is like, don't trust a man. They're going to let you down. They're incompetent. Like all of this messaging that really, again, as we were talking about before, has put us in these adversarial roles with one another. But if we think about like the fundamental pain point of men versus women, and this is like historic pain points for women, what I find is there is like a pain point around abandonment. And it's sort of like, back when we were in the woods and we needed like the tribe, the group to protect us, there was a fear of abandonment. And so for generations, we've sort of cultivated these survival strategies to keep from being abandoned. But for men, their sort of core pain point is around shame and being shamed by the group and not being man enough and not being able to pull your weight with the group, right? And so when we sort of shame our husbands for doing it wrong and sort of nitpicking at how he could have done this differently, we're activating that core pain point. And they're only going to allow themselves to feel and experience that so many times before they just shut down and say, just let me know what you want me to do. I'm not even going to try because you're just going to criticize the way I do it. And we have, there's been a movement of calling that like weaponized incompetence. And I was like, I don't know if that's true so much as a little bit. As women, it becomes incumbent upon us. And I know this was so much of my work and really looking at myself and saying, I gotta let go and trust in life a little bit more than I am and not like be in the space of feeling like I need to control all the things. And it's like people sort of rise to the expectations that we have of them. So if I see my partner and I see my husband as, my hero and he's amazing and he does all of those things, what we appreciate that he does appreciates, it becomes bigger. But what we sort of criticize in our husband, that becomes our experience of reality. So I would say to the person that wrote in, how can I ask my husband if I'm in that wounded masculine space, how can I come into the healthy feminine space of vulnerability and say, I'm overwhelmed, I'm flooded. Would you be willing to help me come up with a plan for us to divide and conquer some of the things that we have to get done so that it doesn't feel like I'm in this space of resentment, which I don't want to be with you because I love you, right? And then here's the important part though. Once we divide and conquer and your husband has a list of things that are his things to get done, you got to step out of it, girl. Like you got to let him own those. You got to it may not be done the way that I would do it and let that be okay, right? Like you may have different ways of doing things, but as Andrew was saying, they will get done. It just becomes, I got to have a little bit more trust in the unfolding of all the things,
And what I always wonder with these scenarios is how much are the children being used as a resource? We tend to, these are two teenage girls. I'm wondering if they're being sort of rather over-mothered.
And that's a really important point you're making, because I think a lot of times what ends up happening is we can really get caught up in this identity of mother and that I'm not prioritizing myself. I'm not doing things that make me feel like me and make me feel alive. And that is also a distortion of our feminine energy. And what ends up happening is, to your point, if these are teenage girls, very soon they're going to be out of the house and, not there for them to be the thing that you're overwhelmed with taking care of. And so it's really important for me to build a sense of self and things that I love and things that are turning me on and making me feel that sense of life force so that I don't feel that tremendous sense of loss when that identity of mother starts to get restructured in a few years. And so I would say, to the point you're making, Andrew, it's really important to start to put some of that in place now. And how do we divide and conquer so that when it's my husband's turn, I can go to a yoga class or I can do things that feel really good for me instead of being in that space? Because normally resentment means I'm not pouring enough into myself.
That's interesting. Resentment means I'm not actually putting enough energy into myself. And we sort of hope that everybody's going to notice this and come forward and do these things, but they don't.
You can tell when someone's worked with couples because of what Andrew just said. And it's the person who's the overfunctioner in a relationship dynamic is sort of hoping that at some point everyone will see how much I'm pouring into them and they'll start pouring into me the same way and they'll love me in the way that I'm loving them. That never happens. The people that you're pouring into, they just think that's who you are. They just think you function that way. So it's you got to stop, girl, because nobody's going to get the message. That's just not how it works.
Sadly, if you ask for things, you're likely to get them. If you don't ask for them, you don't get. Sad, but that's the truth.
Yeah. But I think what you just said is important, because the reason we don't ask for things is because it's vulnerable, because that person could say no or not be willing to meet me. And that's sort of a lot of times a childhood pain point of when someone didn't show up for me or my needs weren't met. And so it becomes vulnerable to ask for someone's buy-in and their consent on supporting me. But to your point, I won't ever know if I just live in the space of resentment. So we're so conditioned that vulnerability is weakness, and asking for support from our partner means that somehow, we're not capable or we're weak. And I would say it's the opposite. It takes so much strength to say, yeah, I get overwhelmed. I'm a human being. I would really love for you to support me.
So, the question's got to be, the title of your book is Sovereign Love. Is sovereign love when the masculine and feminine are in balance, and how do we know we've got it?
I think it's an ongoing process of continuing to take responsibility for my own energy. But I think, to me, the thing of sovereignty is, if you think about like a sovereign country, it's sort of a country that is defining itself for itself, creating its own structures. And I think that is what we're learning to do in relationships as we evolve and individuate, and that what this relationship is true for the people involved in it, moment to moment, day by day, and that we're really in that present-centered awareness of co-creating a relationship that feels really good for both of us, versus feeling like we have to be anything other than who we came into these lives to be. There's an incredible intelligence in the things that we long for and the ways that we want to show up. It's just like, can we trust ourselves enough to be that?
And this is the really difficult thing, and the really great thing about now. The great thing now is the rules have all been changed, and you can actually do it any way you like, which is absolutely wonderful. The bad thing is you've actually got to work out each one of these things. You just can't take it down off the wall anymore. And that's an awful lot of negotiation, and we're terrible at negotiating. At least most of my clients are no good at negotiating.
Yeah. And what is that Spider-Man quote? With incredible power or with great responsibility comes great power. I don't know. But the thing is, like, we've always had the power, but it's just like we have to take ownership of that, and we have to do the work to say the thing and be in that space of trusting that, things will work out as they're meant to, but I have to have the vulnerable conversation, and I have to trust in this partnership enough to want to show up in that way.
So we're getting towards the end of our conversation today. So I have to ask you, what makes your life meaningful?
Oh, goodness. One of my favorite spiritual teachers is Wayne Dyer. And I remember I heard him in an interview once say something that I quote quite often, where he said, "The mantra of the lower self is I need more. The mantra of the higher self is how do I serve?" And I think what makes my life meaningful is really utilizing the experiences of my life to show up in service and hopefully pay forward some of what I've been given by various teachers and teachings to find a little bit more peace in my skin. And I think that's what I love to do most and what makes my life meaningful for me.
That's a lovely quote. Can you give it to us again so we can really appreciate it?
Sure. It's the mantra of the lower self is I need more. The mantra of the higher self is how do I serve?
Well, our conversation is drawing towards the end, but it's not over if you are a supporter of the Meaningful Life. We're going to be talking about this mother wound, the patriarchal mother wound that is passed down through the generations. So we're going to look about that and find out a little bit about how to heal it. If you'd like to hear that conversation, you can get the bonus material by subscribing directly via Apple or Spotify. And if you want to become a supporter of The Meaningful Life and have my undying gratitude and unlock the bonus material this way, here are the details.
You've been listening to The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. You can follow Andrew on Twitter, like him on Facebook, and please leave a review wherever you consume your podcasts. Making, editing, and distributing The Meaningful Life comes with substantial costs, and we'd like to ask for your help. Visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material for every program, send in a letter to be discussed by Andrew and his guests, and join a community of other people seeking to make their life meaningful. At the gold level, you get even more benefits. Production of The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall is by Michael Dooney. Social media by Madeleine Healy. Sound engineering and theme tune by Sebastian de la Luz Mendoza. And I'm Susie Colick. please tell your friends and spread the word. Thank you.